You all know that I no longer work for Daily Maverick. So to punish me for this, they made me not only host the last panel of the day when everyone's tired and fed up, but they also made me interview these two guys who are most famous for being fired. Well, they were famous, a little bit famous. I mean, we knew a little bit about them before, but since they got fired, they've become these warriors against state capture. But, you know, they're famous for other things as well. Some people who were here earlier, our other guests who have now left, and we believe that they are now in a pub in Bree Street. They think that these two are friends of white monopoly capital. We'll have to ask them if they are. But I think what you'll see as soon as they come up is that this is also the most famous bromance in South African politics. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Pravin Gordhan and Cebisi Jonas. So you're getting a standing ovation before we even start, so I hope you live up to the hype of what people expect of you. I'm very disappointed that the other people who were ready to welcome you this morning not here. You need your mic.
Oh, yeah. I was saying it's a free country, they're still welcome.
So, you know, if you think that your colleagues and your comrades in the ANC don't like you already, imagine how they're going to feel about you knowing that you've been hanging around with like 200 journalists in this room for most of today.
No, most people in the ANC just love us.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know.
No, because those are the people who want a better country for all 55 million people. So it's a minority that won't like us because we say the wrong things and you bring us on a platform after the Amabungani guys. That makes it worse.
So on the 1st of April this year, you hosted or you addressed a media briefing for the last time at the National Treasury. And I asked you then, why were you fired? And the two of you went into a huddle and you came out saying, we need to connect the dots. Now, for the past 4 months, we've all been going dotty, connecting these dots. But you basically issued a challenge to South Africa, to the media, to civil society to connect these dots. How do you think South Africa has responded to that call over the past 4 months?
Well, I think as your last session pointed out, I think we've done very well. Whether, as Ridi was pointing out, people who we normally would think are outside of the loop of what goes on in our country, to the most sophisticated banker or financial, what shall we say, arranger. There's an understanding that state capture is real, that many of our institutions are in trouble as a result. There's talk about bailing out SAA, there's talk about additional so-called soft support for Eskom, there's admissions of guarantees given by a CFO without the permission of the board, allegedly. We don't really know what the truth is. And the Gupta leaks have in fact reinforced all of those facts and perceptions and made it very real. I think the real question now is how do we take more of those dots to the ground? How do we get a little bit more angry about them? And more importantly, how do we get involved, as was being pointed out earlier on, rather than just be passive observers and intellectually connect the dots?
So the two of you were working very hard, particularly after your reappointment, after former Minister Nene's firing. The two of you were on a concerted campaign to try and protect South Africa from a ratings downgrade, to help you know, revive the economy, to inspire confidence in South Africa and the economy. And as soon as you got fired, things went downhill. We were downgraded to junk. We are now in a recession. And things are looking pretty bleak. You know, a few of us, or a few people who spoke earlier were a bit optimistic, but The situation does look pretty bleak for South Africa. You know, looking back at how the work you put in and where the situation is now, how does that make you feel?
You can start.
Thank you. Look, I mean, there's been a trend, a downward trend, by the way, I think, and that's what we're trying to prevent in a sense. If you think about it, IMF normally have, is it Article 4 reports annually on countries. If you go back and read some of those reports, I mean, historically, we used probably, there will be 1 or 2 technical issues raised, but there's never been a point at which the fiscal integrity of the country has been questioned. And since I took office, I think what I found interesting is that there's been an increasing change in that in the analysis given by IMFs and a couple of other agencies that do analysis of countries. And that change has been increasingly to raise questions about the credibility of fiscus. And that was very important. In part, I think it was beginning to point to what I think most of us already were trying to fight against, the fact that the credibility of the state was disintegrating. I mean, SOCs were a runaway train fiscally, liabilities going through the roof, inability to even deliver on the services that they were supposed to deliver on. There were also centers for financial racketeering. I mean, it was just growing, as it were, in a sense, lack of governance and all of those issues, which were pointing to a problem. But side by side with that was another reality that inequality was on the increase, was deepening. And I think South Africa, probably for the last 5 years or even more, has been growing through a very weak growth, which almost adds to the problems that we have. So in a sense, I think when you look back, you think that part of what we're trying to do was try to turn this tide around. In order to turn it around, we felt it necessary to build a broader partnership of society, bring in private sector into the play. Because I think coming from the ANC, as we both do, statism is always a critical part of liberation politics. And the extent to which the ANC has been able to move out of statist orientation and approach to governance and economy, I think I would argue very strongly and quite categorically too that we have not been able to do that. There's still a notion that the economy is the state. And I think part of what we're trying to build into the national dialogue was increasingly realizing that 75% of output in the economy is private sector. Our inability to move the private sector to greater and more investment was a problem for the economy. Our inability to create a more certain environment, policy-wise and in many other ways, was a problem for the economy. Our inability to focus the country on growth and inclusive growth was a problem. And I dare say that, fortunately, I didn't attend the policy conference, but sitting from outside, I still think that we don't get it now.
You don't get it?
We don't get it. We don't realize the importance of growth and the importance of inclusive growth.
Who doesn't get it?
I'm saying the ANC and government does not get it.
If I can just add, you can't, particularly after the events of the last 6 months or so, you cannot have an environment where, firstly, everything you do actually diminishes confidence when you've got to increase confidence, diminishes the prospects of investment by the private sector, but in fact also by the public sector, because if you have a narrowing fiscal and deteriorating fiscal environment, then even the investment on the side of the state doesn't happen on the same scale. Add to that the corruption factor and the lack of effective implementation, that makes investment even slower coming from the state itself. So on the one hand, we think we're going to get the confidence factor right when everything we're doing is actually continuing to take the confidence factor down. They call us back on the, whatever, the 26th of March as we land on the tarmac of Heathrow Airport through an SMS. But we left behind 2 business leaders who had taken off a whole week to visit the UK and the US and alienated those people who've actually worked with us for the last 15 months at that time to avoid the ratings downgrade, to build confidence, to get more investment going, and move the private sector also towards what is today commonly known as inclusive growth. And we actually think that coming out with another list of activities, which is supposed to be constituting a plan, is going to be a substitute for really effectively galvanizing all the resources we have in this country towards the objective of reducing unemployment, reducing poverty, and getting everybody's resources into the ground, so to speak, so that we can actually achieve that, and at the same time, allow rampant looting of state resources. That equation doesn't work. So this is where 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, it actually equals 4. And that 4 just doesn't sync with what the country requires at this point in time. And so we will continue to get a deteriorating environment. Now, some would say we are talking ill outside of the ranks of the organization. Well, this isn't that. It's about being self-critical. It's about saying that if we are responsible for, as the ANC, taking this country forward, then let's do our best to carry out the mandate that we've been given and take it a lot more seriously than we are at the moment.
So your experience in government for over several years now, there were signs that things were going wrong. For the rest of us, we've been experiencing this from the outside. You were within the state. You could see things were going wrong. There were warning bells ringing. Since the 28th of May this year, we've just seen how horribly wrong things have gone. We've seen what exactly has happened to our state. So you couldn't have been surprised by the Gupta leaks. I'm sure you were surprised by the amount of information that's coming out in it, but surely you couldn't have been surprised that this actually happened.
Look, I mean, the story has been very clear. I mean, I think there have a number of reports generated by different state agencies, including principally Treasury, but also including Auditor General reports, et cetera, all of them paint one picture. And then the picture that they paint is you have an economy that is in crisis. But they also point another important picture, which is the picture of state failure. And I think that has been very clear. I mean, what the leaks and some of those who decided to say this or that and whistleblowers in different corners have done is to actually give substance to that. But fundamentally, they brought a new dimension, which I think is an important dimension, that who is in power. And it's very clear if you read the leaks that you actually have a shadow state running the country effectively. That's the implication of the leaks. The fact that I think after the firing of Comrade Praveen and Jonas being relieved of his position, and what was clear is the comments from the leadership of the ANC was that we didn't know. And that should tell you something about who then runs the country. We've seen that, I mean, spreading across in a number of occasions, people saying, no, we don't know. We are surprised. And how can you be surprised if you're saying you are a ruling party or a party in power, a governing party? It only tells you one message, the message that you are actually not holding power. Somebody else is doing that. It talks about subversion of democracy. It talks about the fact that your democracy is under threat because probably those who run the country are the unelected. And that's probably the crisis. The unelected tend to be less accountable, if at all. And the unelected don't concern themselves with issues of economic growth and development, et cetera, That's not the area of interest. Their area of interest is personal accumulation and strengthening their hold of the state and the economy to advance interest. What's happening in the mining sector, perhaps little has been written about it. Clearly, as a country, we should actually be smiling with the boom in commodity prices and the mining sector globally minerals coming back into a better position globally. But as South Africa, we're not benefiting from that. And the extent to which we're not benefiting is reflective of the fatal flaw that the state is geared towards a wrong direction.
So I think there were a couple of things that were surprising. The one is the scale of what was going on. The fact that petty thieving, if you like, might have been happening at one or other level, that some major tenders were going wrong. And there were, as the VC pointed out, various reports indicating that. But I think the earlier panel was asked, what's the number? I tried to ask a few people that question. What number will we attach to the scale at which things are happening? And some are saying that about 100 billion rands might have disappeared. 100 billion rands is approximately 8.5% to 9% of total government expenditure. If you remove the interest factor, about 150 odd billion rands this year, it's close to just over 9% of total expenditure.
What could you have used that in your budget that you presented? What could you have used that for?
You could double all the social grants.
You could double the social grants?
Yeah, all the social grants cost us about 110, 120 billion rands at the moment. So you could double the social grants with the amount of money that has been taken out of the system. So the second factor that we should be worried about is the impunity with which all this happens. We don't care what happens to the country. As we've heard, something can drop, you just pick it up, it doesn't really matter. But impunity is a dangerous stage to reach. It's a dangerous stage to reach. It means that nothing bothers you, no conscience factor comes into this. You don't care about what impact you're having on the 55 million people, and in particular, the 7 million youth or so that are walking around unemployed and without hope at this point in time. And that don't care factor is a dangerous stage to reach as our country. And that's why the kind of connecting of the dots on the one hand, mobilizing people on the basis of the connecting of the dots, and making it clear that those who are responsible, both within the state and outside the state, A, should be stopped from doing this, and B, should be called to account. We know all the problems that were raised earlier on about calling them to account, but that doesn't mean that our efforts must stop.
You raised the issue of conscience. I'm going to come back to that later on.
Is that a threat?
So let's talk about the state-owned companies. This is one issue you raised. The day you were, when you were reappointed as finance minister, this is one of the things you identified as problem areas. You spoke particularly about SAA and what you wanted to do and what was necessary for a turnaround at SAA. So you knew that from day one when you took the job, but you were prevented from doing that. Are you able to say now why you were prevented?
No, we're still bound by the Official Secrets Act or whatever it's called. But what is self-evident to all of you, if you have been following what's been going on, is that it took us a long time to put together a new board for SAA. We failed in ensuring that we got a new chairperson of the board who would be more experienced and more effective at leading that board and putting them...
It's not as if you didn't try, right?
Yeah, no, just listen carefully to my words. Thirdly, the Treasury officials were working virtually on a weekly basis to ensure that the liquidity situation within SAA would be sustained. Fourth, they were working very closely with the lenders, the major banks that had lent, what, almost 19 billion rands by that time, and would be wanting reassurances: when's your new board, when's your new CEO going to be appointed, when's your new CFO going to be appointed. And it's the credibility of the Treasury that actually carried us through on a month-by-month basis. The fourth is to ensure at that time that SAA has an effective strategy to, inverted commas, turn around the operational efficiency and profit-making capability of the airline. And all of that, if given time, would have actually worked if we took it in the right direction, difficult as it might have been. But today we're talking about easy bailouts of the airline with no quid pro quo. Right? And there are all sorts of tenders that need to be looked into, that the new board must be able to do so, and lots of questions to be asked about various things that have happened under the old board. There's some excellent people on the new board who, if given the chance, would certainly steer the airline in a new direction.
Well, there's a new CEO announced today, so is that sufficient, the new members of the board, the new CEO? Is there a chance for a turnaround now?
It's a good start. Let's give the CEO an opportunity, say in the next 3 to 6 months, to see what can be done without interference of the wrong type in what that CEO requires to do.
Mr. Jonas, let's talk about Eskom. Did you have any idea about the extent of the rot?
Look, I mean, I just wanted to kind of close PG's point on SOC. But there's a bigger discussion that as a country we've almost avoided up to now, at least, you know. Just to talk about our SOCs and their role, broadly speaking, in the economy, and whether we need to change them and transform them. If you take Eskom as a case in point, you have a vertically integrated SOCs that spans across all areas of energy supply in the country. The question that you should ask yourself, is it the most efficient way of structuring this thing? It's probably globally amongst some of the biggest SOCs you have in the energy sector. Now, it's very clear that the fact that you cannot deal with that and transform that has huge implications for the energy sector in the country. So you cannot even think about transformation of the energy sector if you cannot deal with the elephant in the room, which is called Eskom. It has become an interest center in itself, and therefore blocking all possibilities of transformation. But in addition to that, I think the fact that we have such a monopoly in the energy sector also implies that state capture is easy. It also implies that corruption is easy, because you have all of this, all of what you need in the energy sector concentrated in that. Now, the inefficiencies in a structure like Eskom, for instance, has huge implications for the cost of electricity, the cost of doing business in the country, but also generally access to energy for the poor. So this thing of saying that the state must own these things, and because again, ideologically, it might make sense. It's a pity Rose is not here. Ideologically, it might make sense if you think about it, for the state to own these things. If you unpack the state ownership, actually you will realize our benefit ends there. Because the reality of the matter is that 90% of capital expenditure by these state-owned enterprises is through the private sector. And given the information from the leaks now, and many of other people who have said, it's very clear that who benefits from that. So the problem really is not about how Eskom is structured, it's about how to ensure that an elite continues to benefit from these entities. And I think the big question, I would still come back to the point, we need to discuss the role and place of SOCs, but also to see how we can ensure that we transform them to meet the demands of the day.
So at the time when you were dismissed, the two of you were talking the language that seemed to be different this year, certainly, in the budget speech and in the speeches, in the pieces you've written, Mr. Jonas. You've been talking about this broad economic consensus, about a new perspective in terms of how to do the budgeting process, how to respond to the challenges in the country, how to respond to the high levels of poverty, but also how to respond to what has not been working. Mr. Jonas, you've been saying that the post-1994 consensus is no longer viable, that we need to go. But from what I can take out from what you're saying, this is not necessarily the same language that the ANC is speaking. The ANC still believes that whatever was discussed at the policy conference in July is where the solutions lie. Your language is different.
Look, I mean, let's face it, I mean, the state has serious credibility problems. And there is huge mistrust across different sectors of the economy. So if you're going to argue that the withholding of capital is a problem in our economy, concentration is a problem in our economy, and a whole range of things that we say are a problem in our economy, you've got to realize that the state, as it stands now, has no credibility to be able to lead a process of addressing some of the issues that we're talking about. I mean, when Jackson was sitting here, I was sitting there, I nearly jumped when he said, the state must establish a tribunal for whatever, for media. The problem is, deal with the credibility of the state first, and deal with the credibility of the ruling party secondly. Deal with the credibility of leadership in the country. And you can only do that if you open a platform where different sectors of society can debate the future of South Africa and begin to hammer a different agreement that takes us out of the crisis we're in as a country. And that's the simple point I was making. It's very clear that inequality has grown, unemployment is growing. Clearly, we're unable to grow the economy. You need a conversation. You're unable to do it, and you're not going to be able to do it tomorrow unless you engage the entire society in that conversation.
So you were not able to pursue that vision
Can I just follow up? Because I think those are real challenges, but they're not impossible challenges to overcome. We showed in 2016 that we have good South Africans in every sector of society, that they're capable of developing a single focus, particularly where there's self-interest involved. So all of us had an interest in making sure that we don't get a ratings downgrade, in making sure that we stabilize growth, and in making sure that we begin to debate that future that we are talking about now. And then it began to gel around the question of inclusive growth. And yeah, you can talk about radical this or radical that, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, it is still whether all of us, particularly the privileged sector of South African society, is willing to become part of a process, one, of building consensus, but two, of generating change, where that feeling of inclusivity and that feeling of benefiting from that which is happening in our economy is palpable to ordinary South Africans. And my view is that if you have a different leadership approach, a different intent where the country and the national interest is put first and everything else is put second, and we get rid of those who are planning by emails, the downfall of our economy in South Africa, we can turn this country around in 6 months, not in terms of achieving 5% growth, but building a platform on which that process can actually begin to take itself forward. The question is, can we actually set aside self-interest and our banking accounts in Dubai or wherever they are as the immediate priority and say this country and its well-being is the immediate priority? That's the real challenge.
How do we get that leadership change you're talking about?
Well, as I said, I know you're thinking about one or two individuals. That's not necessarily the case. My view is that if leadership in a particular sector is unable or unwilling to move in that direction, the rest of the country must move nonetheless. And I think the Civil Society Forum and its creation in Johannesburg the other day, the kind of movements that we're likely to see next week as well, are all important generators of, firstly, involvement, but secondly, of consensus building around, A, what kind of South Africa we want, as my colleague is saying, but secondly, how do we get there as quickly as possible without too much of damage being done to this country. So remember, every single day, we allow the current trajectory to continue. There's huge damage that is being caused on the one hand, and I think in the earlier panel this emerged as well, it takes a long, long time to rebuild once destruction happens to key institutions and processes in society.
So you think those activities of next week, you know, whatever's going on, it seems to be a bustle and excitement about next week, that those activities can bring about the change you're talking about?
You know, if you listen carefully, I was saying it's the beginning of the process, you see. So some of us lived through the UDF period, and we know what it means to put together out of 600 fragments, what appeared to, in 1981-82, it looked like 600 fragmented organizations. By August 1983, there was the United Democratic Front. It was possible to put it together. That's within the DNA of our country, right? And build on that DNA.
So,
and therefore, I guess the point is we need to think beyond December. I think that's probably the central message. And we need to think beyond the 8th around some of the questions. We must build a stronger national social movement that can drive these things.
Yeah, that's an unconcluded debate between the two of us, but it's a different matter.
you can have it here. We'll all, we won't say anything, we'll just listen in. So, Mr. Gordon, you haven't been able to pursue that vision that you had in mind, but you have a new role now in Parliament as an MP, and you sit in portfolio committees. But Parliament is a very contested space now. I'm not talking as yet about August 8th, but generally it's, it has its ebb and flows. Some things like the SABC, it's a success story. On other things like Nkandla, it was an extremely frustrating process. You are accused of not speaking out on Nkandla, but now you are playing a very vocal role in terms of, in the portfolio committees and what's going on in state-owned enterprises. Does the switch come naturally when you are, not bound by what a cabinet position binds you to?
Why are you being so difficult today? No, I think the Nkandla process is different from what is happening now. One thought that people who are given the responsibility to attend to that issue, both within and outside of Cabinet and Parliament, would come to the right kind of conclusions. And I think that's a very good example of an instance where you have to go through the pain of that process in order to learn what not to do the next time. I don't know whether speaking up, I know we often judge by have you spoken up. There are many things that we do, particularly when you belong to the executive, and there's another person here that you're going to talk to later who can verify that we can't talk about openly. But that doesn't mean that we were complicit in what was actually happening at the time. So let me put that warning sign up. In terms of Parliament, I think as the Constitutional Court has pointed out in its recent judgment, Parliament has a particular and very important role to play in a constitutional democracy and in holding the executive to account. So I think there's a new vitality that Parliament is enjoying, as you pointed out it through the SABC inquiry. And members of Parliament, some, not necessarily all, are beginning to, in a sense, find their energy and intent again, as you will see through some of the activities that are going on right now. But some are also, let's be frank, misled into being part of another camp where they are a group of members who have gone to the public protector and say investigate Treasury, the FIC, the SARB, etc., which is the counter move, right, against those who are intent upon doing the right thing. So be aware that the tentacles that you are referring to through the discourse through part of today reach quite deep into the parliamentary ranks as well. And those people need to be held to account in the same way as any other member would be as to why are they taking these initiatives, whom are they being instructed by. It can't be a kind of bona fide process as far as I'm concerned, given the context in which we find ourselves today.
Okay. So what you're saying and what you have been saying might have resonance in audiences like this, large sections of the population, but last week, for example, your experience at the University of Johannesburg, where you see a deep-seated anger from younger people. And that anger is prevalent in society, and you see it with the level of rebellion, with social delivery protests, and I suppose we all know that it stems out of frustration with the situation in the economy. But people also seem to have bought in to the line that has been given, that this is the fault of white monopoly capital, and that radical economic transformation is the answer. Mr. Jonas, how do you deal with this conundrum where so many people believe this?
Look, I mean, earlier on there was a discussion, a panel here, I mean, discussion about the role of civil society, etc. I think part of, and that's the debate PG is talking about, part of the challenge we have is that when civil society was effective in the 80s, etc., you had a broad national movement that was able to lead and coalesce those interests into a powerful movement. In a sense, I think with the unbanning of the ANC played that role, as it were. Part of the challenge probably that we are not bold enough, many people are not bold enough to say, is the problem that the ANC has itself been weakened, if not captured in many ways. And in a sense, some of those things that were supposed to be driven by a movement that was principled, that was focused, we're losing that, and there's a vacuum in that sense. The movement that is emerging, it would seem to me, I mean, with civil society organizations focusing on different issues, beginning to raise hard questions about different issues, it's very clear that this needs to be consolidated into a national movement. And that national movement must begin to build an agenda about where South Africa should be going. And that could be the basis of engaging society at large, but also engaging the powers that be around this thing. And that's why I think work done by SACCs and the foundations, etc., it needs to be encouraged because it deepens the conversation, it deepens the understanding of the crisis that we're facing. But we do need to encourage those things and support them.
So there was a lot of anger at your firing, but there's been a build-up to this. So, Mr. Jonas, you were the original corruption buster when it comes to state capture. And Mr. Gordon, you almost found...
I can avoid this.
And Mr. Gordon, you almost found yourself in the dock last year. And it was basically to stop you in your tracks from what you were doing. And for people to get access to the National Treasury. So there was a reaction from society, and the NPA backed off. But it seems that you two pushed the NPA so far that they've backed off forever now. We can't actually trace them. But firstly, let me ask you, do you know what has happened to the investigation against you?
I don't know, there seem to be little dribs and drabs indicating that every now and again, I don't know under what kind of inspiration, spiritual or otherwise, some kind of investigation goes on.
So it's ongoing?
I don't know. I think you must ask the people who are there, but it would appear so. But you know, let's look at the earlier part of your question, and let's be frank about it. There was a crisis when Minister Nene was asked to leave the job, 9/12. Then on the 13th of December, it happened to be a Sunday of 2015, I'm asked to take the job. And as I've said before, my first answer wasn't, yes, I'll take it. I was persuaded to take it. Then, 2 months later or less, the 27 questions begin to arrive. So somewhere between the 13th of December and that event, I think it was the 19th of February, the processes which the emails are now beginning to describe in different contexts obviously kicked in, and the appointment was seen as an obstruction. Remember that in October of 2015, they had failed to bribe him, right? So just get the timeline right. And then the whole process of harassment started, where even cabinet colleagues will have press conferences and say, there was this rogue unit and there was supposed to be spying equipment. We're still waiting to find it, by the way, right? And some parts of the media regrettably played the wrong role in that instance as well. And so 2016 was about harassment, which said, get out of office of your own accord, so we can't be held responsible. and that reached a particular pinnacle by the time we get to the 31st or 30th of March this year. And secondly, it was the fantastic resistance to injustice which the media on the one hand and civil society organizations and South Africans more generally demonstrated. So that was the beginning, if you like, of connecting another set of dots in some ways. And it shows that South Africans can stand up to injustice, as they have before 1994, and need to be watchful during the current period about these events as well. So these weren't just simple so-called firings and hirings. In the context of the emails and the leakages, connect those dots as well. It was about getting people out of the way at critical points in time in order that they wouldn't act as obstructions. Now, the group of academics who've presented the Silent Coup report have in fact tracked a number of capturing incidents, if you like, and they've got a pattern that emerges. And that pattern can be seen every single time. Now, there's some news that's going to come out about one of the institutions in the next day or two. You'll see the same pattern. If there's a good person that's standing in the way, find some way of getting some alleged offense laid at that person's door, then harass that person. That person gets tired and says, well, I don't need this in my life. I'd rather move on. Replace that person in a critical position in the organization, and you have yet another door opened in order to lay one's hands on the resources of the organization. And the question is, now I think we've got to find a way of going beyond connecting the dots. It's about acting on connecting the dots. And what are the techniques available? What are the levers available, as I said earlier on, to stop this impunity with which people are acting?
Okay, let's talk about that connecting of the dots. So there's been a lot of dots out there. We're seeing stars, there's so many dots. But you two are in a unique position in that you knew the dots were there, probably didn't know as much that as emerged in the Gupta leaks, but you knew the dots, you told us to connect it. What are we not seeing? Just help us all. You know, journalists are generally nice people. Okay, I'm lying, we're not nice people, but you know, we need to get there to where you're pointing. What are we not seeing?
Look, I mean, I'm sure, I mean, the leaks are going to make it very clear that there are still huge areas that we need to focus on. I think there's still a very big chunk of work that we need to do in trying to understand the link between corruption, state capture, and economic performance. Because I think that area is something that we have not actually articulated quite strongly. The work that the academics are doing is shedding light to that, but I think do you mean like sabotage? It's how that whole process of state capture sabotages growth and stunts growth effectively, and it's something that and it leads to unemployment. You've got figures of people losing their jobs because of the state capture and corruption issues that have been happening. So there's a lot of work that we need to do around that so that we draw that connection. The second area is that I do believe that the local state and provincial state has not been looked at quite robustly. Because I do believe that you have a Gupta lookalike in every local state, in every municipality, for instance. I mean, and it's something that we have not paid our attention to look at the extent of state capture, the extent of corruption within local authorities, etc., because that's a big issue. I would still argue that we have to look at. But the third area, of course, is what, because I mean the reference, the broad reference to the criminal justice system in the state capture thing is an important one, because it actually tells whether as a country we'll be able to deal with state capture and with corruption or not. At the moment, it's very clear that the criminal justice system is highly paralyzed, completely paralyzed actually in certain instances. The judiciary remains strong, but for how long? I mean, so what is the extent of vulnerability of the judiciary? You have to look at institutions like IEC. I mean, imagine if the IEC get captured. What are the consequences of that for our democracy? Now, these are areas that we need to look at now quite seriously. And again, if you think about it, institutions like PIC, GEP are critical because, I mean, those are pensions of public servants. Imagine if those are captured and those pensions are misdirected, because effectively what it implies is that the state will have to shoulder the burden and then you can point to countries where public pensions are paid through current account. It's a huge problem if that happens, if we reach that point. So I would say that the work moving forward should be about, as we organize ourselves, as we organize civil society, how do we protect some of the institutions? And how do we ensure that those institutions that still work continue to work and we shield them from capture? That's, I think, the part of mobilization that we should do.
Okay, but let's just talk about the PIC. Sorry, Mr. Gordon. Yeah. The PIC, that's 2 trillion rand of people's pensions and savings. Should people be worried about that? Is there potential to loot the PIC? Is there a way, an ability to do it?
Look, I mean, the point I'm making is that all public institutions are vulnerable. I mean, are vulnerable. That's the point I'm trying to make. That if you have a slippage, and PIC, by the way, is an asset manager and for GPF, and if there's a major failure and collapse in GPF, it means the state fiscus must jump in, effectively. The fiscus is the guarantor of GPF. So your problem is that and you have countries where the public pensions fail and collapse. And when they do collapse, it actually implies that you're paying public pensions for civil servants through the current account. It means that when the economy swings left or right, it will determine whether people get their pensions or not. It's a very significant risk for the country. So I'm just saying that all institutions, I mentioned IEC deliberately, because if you're thinking about state capture, you cannot argue that there is a holy cow. State capture has no holy cows. And I would dare say that let's look at all institutions.
Okay, but all the state capture has been about taking money out of the institutions. The IEC, is that possible? Or
the reality, remember that state...
how would it be captured if it's captured?
You're not capturing the state for any reason except that it allows you to have the power to accumulate more. And elections are a critical vehicle towards, I mean, holding power in government in any case. Now imagine when your popularity and everything else collapses, it makes sense. And you have incidents in other countries, examples where the elections institutions just kept captured and elections are just a formality, you know the outcome. I'm saying we're not yet there, but we must not think that we can't reach there. Okay. That's the point I'm making. We're not there, but don't assume that we'll never reach that point. We need to be very vigilant as a country. This thing of state capture is, from where I'm sitting, is a big issue. I mean, it actually demonstrates the vulnerability of democracy, the vulnerability of our institutions across the board.
Mr. Gordon, sorry, I interrupted you earlier.
No, that's fine. That's the prerogative of the chair, unfortunately. But I'm joking. Don't take me seriously. I just want to reinforce that. Apart from state capture in the negative sense, there's a direct relationship between participating in elections as political parties and being backed as those political parties by particular interest groups, gaining access to state power, then using state power for either good things or bad things. And that's why people enter politics, to influence the manner in which state resources and the leverage that the state offers actually be used for one or other purpose. And so politics and state capture overlap in that sense. The second point is we run also the danger at the moment of very smooth narratives, right? You have the fake news on the one side, but there's also a set of individuals who have become quite smooth. And if one is not watchful enough, one doesn't quite detect what that smoothness is covering at this point in time. It's about the same point as being alert, about capture in the broadest sense, potential or real. The third is a much more difficult issue, but one that we need to confront. The previous panel made some references to it. This is not a unique ANC or South African problem only. It's a worldwide problem. It's a systemic problem where the top 1% and 10% accumulate benefits on a humongous scale, as Piketty and others have demonstrated. Some use it for very good purposes and philanthropic purposes, and others use it for other purposes, to actually gain leverage of one kind or another. And the whole question of illicit flows, of tax havens, of not meeting tax obligations in one's country in order to bolster the fiscus, whether some of it is stolen or not, are all part of a potentially endemic and self-reinforcing cycle that can actually end us into a lot of trouble. On the PIC itself, I think public servants, both retired and current, need to be watchful of their own interests. Because apart from paying pensions from the operational expenses or the operational budget, I mean, if we get that money into the wrong hands, you can actually have a cut in pensions, as has happened in other countries. Take Greece as an example. In fact, the whole of Southern Europe experienced that phenomenon post-2008, if you recall. We don't want to be in that situation. But if you don't want to be in that situation, then both be watchful, but also be active in safeguarding your interests at the end of the day.
So, talking about public servants, there have been calls from the South African Council of Churches, from civil society, for there to be protection for civil servants who come forward, for people who are whistleblowers. Now, Mr. Jonas, I know you don't like talking about this, and you've strayed away from talking about that 600 million rand. But the issue is that if public servants are there and experiencing capture, they have knowledge of it, how hard is it to do what you did?
No, it's just difficult. It's very difficult. But I think we need, as we continue to intensify the campaign around state capture and corruption, we should also begin to also add another element to it, to say that if you don't stop this thing, you will not have a job anyway. So there's no, if you think about it, it's a zero-sum game ultimately, because if you don't stop it, ultimately it will gravitate towards the decline implies. And you have examples elsewhere where there's major cuts in public employment, et cetera, et cetera. And that's when the fiscus cannot carry the burden because of all sorts of things, including failure of the economy as a result of capture or any other reason. So that's one part of it. But the second part of it is that as we encourage civil servants, and there was an interesting conversation with former director generals in government recently, where we had about more than 50 of them trying to, and people engaging them about what their experience is, what they can do, and so on and so on. We do need to mobilize public sector workers to better understand the dangers of state capture and the dangers of corruption and begin to stand against it. Now, it's a lonely road, by the way, at the moment. I mean, anybody who decides to do this must understand that it is a lonely road. So,
it is a lonely road, yes. And it was a lonely road you walked for several months before you came forward. The two of you discussed it. You went to Mr. Gordon and then decided to come out. It's, what was holding you back?
Look, I mean, the part of the big challenge we're facing, I think it's probably many post-independence kind of situations will have a similar challenge. I mean, part of the big challenge we're facing in South Africa is that when you see problems with the liberators, they have the credibility, they have the moral authority, they can still quote their past and less about the present. The difficulty for society to realize that things are wrong is so big. And in many instances, I would argue that the slide is realized many years down the road, when suddenly people realize that actually we're going towards the wall. And when in fact something started maybe 20 years ago, but because it's the jargon of liberation politics, the jargon of the liberation narrative, the jargon of the history of where you come from, becomes a protection for the challenges you're facing today. I mean, it was interesting, Jackson's presentation. It's a pity he's not here. I mean, it was interesting when he was sitting there, he was talking, you were not here. He started talking about the history. Media had done ABC at some point, and so on and so on into the history. But the problem that he could not confront was the credibility of the ANC today and the credibility of government today. Mm-hmm. And that's what we have to deal with. How do we improve it? So that we begin to lead society and government can begin to do what it's supposed to do. Mm. And that's, I think, the issue. Mm. We've got to educate our people that ultimately the agency lies with society and the population, not with party barons.
Don't point to me, please.
At the moment, I think you have a very strong sway towards party barons as opposed to society as a whole.
Okay. So this is a media gathering. Let's talk about the media a little bit. You are generally projected as the good guys. The media has been kind to you, but that was not always the case, Mr. Gordhan. And so, unfortunately...
Thanks for the favor.
So what Jackson was talking about here earlier was that the concerns of the ANC about self-regulation. But you use the system. When you were aggrieved by reportage about you around the Rogue Spy unit, you used the system, and the situation was corrected. Are you content with how the situation was corrected?
No, in that instance, yes. But there's a bigger set of issues that applies not only to the media, it applies more generally, where there are influential sectors of society that have engaged in self-regulation. So, for example, you have an insurance ombud, you have a short-term insurance ombud, you have a banking ombud, and so on. Those are all attempts at self-regulation. And in some instances they work, and we had this debate with accountants and auditors a few years ago as well. So that debate is an ongoing one, whether self-regulation works, or whether in certain instances you actually need to put our heads together in a constructive sense, not in a negative sense, to say, are new mechanisms of regulation required? Now, the same debate happened around 2008, 9, 10, within the G20 and within the key economies in the G20 that were affected by what we today call the Great Recession. Mr. Greenspan of the United States deregulated. You had both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in different terms of office contributing to that deregulation process, and then started an extensive regulatory process as manifested in the Dodd-Frank Act in the United States and the Financial Stability Board and its work in the G20 as well. And some of that has helped to make sure that banks are better regulated, for example. But the problem of too big to fail in that instance is still a problem that the world doesn't have a solution on. So that's at a macro scale. At a micro scale, in respect of the media, I think let's have this as part of our debate. And I wouldn't want to see it as an imposition by the state to control the media, but rather that the media, like any other sector of society, is run by human beings, that you're capable of excesses and mistakes, and there must be a correcting mechanism in place. Some of it might work currently with the current mechanisms that we have. Some of it must be capable of improvement. The one issue that isn't well enough known amongst us is that on the broadcasting side, you have an opting out phenomenon. So not all the broadcasting channels are obliged to belong to a regulatory mechanism, as you know. Your favorite channel just ignores the fact that, that they need to fall under any regulatory mechanism, which means that defamation can go on every single day, and nothing happens as a result. And of course, now we know about Bell Pottinger, notwithstanding what the CEO says, that it's a regrettable thing. They came and messed up our country. It's not just a regrettable thing. That's actually sabotaging our democracy. And they were part of that sabotage for a significant amount of time.
But what they did also targeted the two of you. When it came to fake news, when it came to the Gupta troll accounts, the two of you were targeted in particular. And
we seem to be very popular. I don't know why.
You are. But there's no recourse for that now, is there?
No, but that's why I think that as South Africans, we still got to work out. The DA has done its bit in terms of making sure that the regulatory authorities in the UK hold Bell Pottinger to account. But what was supposed to be the haven of democracy, the UK has decided that these hearings will take place in secret. Why aren't they open, number one? Why isn't Mr. Henderson coming to South Africa to account here for what they've done? And we should say with one voice, we should say with one voice, we want that money back. That's our money.
Okay.
All he talks about is that, now we've had to hire lawyers, we've lost an account and so on. Now, those sorts of crocodile tears don't really help us. Bring that money back and invest it in orphanages for HIV people who've been victims of AIDS in South Africa. And at least they can get some sense into them about what social responsibility means.
Okay, so earlier on we talked about the issue of conscience. We also talked about the events of next week. If someone can please get me a mic to the front row. There is one other person in our audience today who was also fired along with them. It's Mr. Derek Hanekom.
Please be kind to us. We're relieved of our responsibilities.
Okay, he was relieved. Mr. Derek Hanekom is also here with us. He didn't want to come and sit up here with me. But there's a question,
Please applaud Mr. Hanekom, who's been sitting quietly here.
So the two of you remain members of parliament. You both are faced with an enormous decision. And both of you have made it clear you're going to be motivated by conscience. Mr. Hanekom, are there enough people in the benches of parliament who would be motivated by conscience?
Thank you. Thanks for the applause, by the way. It's a pity that Praveen had to ask you to give me that applause. It would have been so nice if it had been spontaneous
Mr. Hanekom,
applause.
please come up so people
Give him
can
another
see
round.
you. Please come up so people can see you.
No, I'm happy here, rooted amongst the masses, because we get protection from the masses here. Can I just say, I'm not the comedian of the show, but when Praveen spoke about crocodile tears, all I could think of was Brian Molefe tears. And maybe that's the new word for these kinds of fake tears. On what's happening in Parliament, Ranjeni, I think it's we're not going to say now what we're going to do or not do. I don't think that would be appropriate. But I think it's very important to know things that both Mr. Jonas and Mr. Gordon have said very clearly, that it's a minority of people that are bringing the ANC into disgrace, that are destroying the credibility of the ANC, and that are in the process destroying our country. But it's a minority of people. So the two of them up there that might be hated by many are loved by many, many more, outside of the ANC and in the ANC. And so Kebisi said sometimes it's a lonely road, but it's not so lonely because many people are so solidly behind you and with you, don't feel lonely. It's difficult sometimes. It's not nice to be called a vile dog, as one of us was called recently.
Two of you were called. There was some half-baked apology, but
Well, the same person that he called Praveen lots of other things. But the same person who happens to be the son of a head of state of a country that we know also called the Human Rights Commission vile dogs. Now, what have we got to? But they don't represent us. They represent something that we are fundamentally against. And I think our big task is to get the greatest cross-section of society to stand up for what is right, to stand up for what is good, and to stand against all of these things that are bad and wrong. And I think that message has come out very clearly from many people. Going back to Parliament, the same situation exists in Parliament. I'm there now as an ordinary member of Parliament, and I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying being on the Finance Committee. I think Praveen is enjoying being on a member of the Portfolio Committee for Public Enterprises. I hope you are, Praveen.
Yes.
There's work to be done there. It's not, you don't have to be a Minister of Finance to do your work or Minister of Tourism. There's work to be done in many places. My assessment of the situation in Parliament is that the majority of ANC members of Parliament are good, decent people with integrity, thinking people who do not like what is going on in our country. They really are deeply worried about what's happening in our country and deeply disappointed by the leadership of the African National Congress. So it's not that they want to break ranks. It's not that they don't regard themselves as members of the ANC. They do. Their disappointment is that they came in, as all of us did, on a ticket on, I think it was said earlier, on the back of this illustrious and glorious movement that has brought so many positive changes to our country, that inspired so much hope in our country. That's what they represent, that's what they love. But they hate it, and they are traumatized when things go so badly wrong. So I would say that safely say and confidently say that more than 50% of African National Congress members of Parliament are very worried about what's going on, and they believe that some kind of action should be taken, soon, because it's just getting worse and worse. The question is, what kind of action will that be?
And whether they will be able to exercise that vote in secrecy or openly.
Well, we'll find out in a few days from now whether it's going to be a secret ballot or not. All information indicates that if it is a secret, if the announcement is that it is not to be a secret ballot, that the matter will be taken on review, in which case it's very unlikely that there will be a vote on the 8th of August, but we'll wait and see. But it doesn't matter how many times and how strongly people in leadership positions say that you're not free agents, say that you were put there by us and you've got to do what we tell you to do. We understand that. I've been a member of Parliament since 1994. We understand this organization. It's a bit of an insult when some people imply that we don't know this organization, we don't understand the rules of the organization, and that we're not representing the best interests of the organization. That's the critical thing. So those that might have a different position are not doing so because they would like to label themselves as free agents. They wouldn't do so because they don't love the organization. They do so precisely because this organization needs to be rescued as much as the state has to be rescued from this capture. The majority of members of Parliament, ANC and other parties, are not captured. It would appear that some people are captured, and it would be a great pity if there's any attempt to capture those that are independent, good people in Parliament. So it doesn't matter how many times you say you cannot vote with your conscience. The people that sit in Parliament do have political consciousness. They understand what is happening in our country. They see what's happening in our country, and they know it has to be changed. So you can't decree, you can't order people to get rid of their political consciousness, nor can you order people to not have a conscience. You cannot do that. So when it comes to the vote, I'm sure ANC members in Parliament will do what they believe is best for our country, and they will do what they believe is best for our organization. Let me just drop a little, it's not a big bombshell, but I don't want to speak for Praveen. I don't want to speak for other members of Parliament, but the last vote of no confidence, motion of no confidence, many of us found it very, very, very difficult to vote against it. We knew that there was a National Executive Committee meeting coming shortly after it. It came in November last year. And so we did what we thought was the right thing to do. Many months later, there's another motion of no confidence. For many of us, it is just that much more difficult to go into that session and vote against this motion of no confidence.
Thank you, Mr. Hanekom, for that. Our time's up. I just have one last question. If that motion of no confidence does not succeed, if the December conference goes horribly wrong, do people like you survive politically? Will there be a good end to this story?
No, my political activism started 45 years ago. It didn't start with any of these things. So these events will come and go, and as long as it's possible to make a contribution in one way or another, I'm sure I can speak for many of us, we will continue to make our contribution, whether it's in government or outside of government, whether it's within an organization or outside an organization. We are lifelong political activists.
Mr. Jonas?
You can't take a short-term view on these issues. I think we're in this thing for a long haul. I mean, we must just brace ourselves for that. I mean, we have to mobilize, we have to continue to understand what's happening, present an alternative to what's happening, and ensure that society is with us all the time. That's not a short-term agenda or project.
And continue to build a solid democracy that future generations can benefit from. That's the joy of political activism. Join us, by the way.
So those are good words to live by, and I think it's testament to the fact that when you get knocked down, we get up again.
I get knocked